talk,
identity,
and access
management.
Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim, how you doing?
I'm good, Jeff. How are you doing?
Pretty good. We've got a guest today, which is exciting. We've got Darran Rolls.
I'm excited.
Which is a pretty good get for us, I would say. He's formerly with SailPoint and now an independent identity management dude. Welcome to the show, Darran.
Thank you. There's a title. That's just I couldn't think what else to put onto my title, so that's what I ended up with, identity management dude.
I think that's a pretty good one because it kind of dovetails, I think, a little bit with what's the movie The Big Lebowski, right? The Dude. So you're the I am dude.
There you go.
There were a couple of things that kind of happened up in the news this week when it comes to IAM, and the most fresh one is Twitter, right? So they had a pretty bad hack where it sounds like, a large number or at least significant type of account, verified accounts, were compromised yesterday. Yesterday being Wednesday, July 2015, or July 15th, I should say. Where there was some sort of Bitcoin scam that was published on a lot of verified accounts, including people like Joe Biden and Elon Musk and Bill Gates, things like that. And I guess it points to the importance of social engineering and privilege access management when it comes to tools, things like that. Darran, do you have any comments or thoughts around kind of what happened?
No, I think you hit a couple of them there. I mean, it's isn't this just the new normal? Nobody seems surprised that this has happened in any way, shape, or form. But it just, what have we really got here? It's pretty much, you might say, surface cybercrime. Right? Someone's trying to propagate an early stage attack on using. Acquiring Bitcoin. I mean, it's not 0-day malware. It's basic social engineering and outright profiteering. So no surprise really. The details will obviously come out about how it's got there, but we can already read into the details. Basic social engineering and abuse of privilege. So nothing new really.
Jim, what are your thoughts on it?
Well, I think when I saw some of the, there's so many layers here. One is, obviously they had somebody they trusted working at Twitter who broke that trust. But that is a problem that I see over and over again with the clients I work with, that there is a small group of trusted individuals who have access to certain features and certain capabilities that could do grave harm to the organization. That's exactly what happened here. So when you get to, the idea of zero trust, I know that has more specific meaning, but I also want to expand the meaning of that. It's like you can't just trust people. You have to have controls and ways to have checks and balances. The number two is something that we keep coming back to. When I saw these Twitter posts, it was like, hey, transfer Bitcoin to me and I'll transfer twice as much Bitcoin back to you. I mean, common sense, if I saw that, I would not have transferred Bitcoin to it. And people keep falling for these traps. I shake my head, like, how in the world do people fall for this? So those are the two things that came to mind. I don't know that I gave a real positive message there, but those are the two things.
But don't you think it's sort of indicative of the nature of attack? It's about numbers. So to your point, who on earth responded? Well, people have responded, right? I mean, the ticker for the Bitcoin coming in has gone up. So just goes to show that if you have a broad enough attack surface, there's always a victim, and that's what we've seen here.
There are a lot of times, Darran, where you'd see like these scams targeted at elderly people, and it's usually on the goodness of their heart. Most of the elderly people I know don't have Bitcoin. So then I think this one came back to people's greed or their hope for a quick buck. But yeah, you're right. It is a numbers game. 100 people might look at it, or 99 people look at it and snicker, and one person thinks, hey, this is the best thing I've heard of. I'll send them $200 and get $400 back. Sounds great.
Yeah, exactly. And it's sort of, I think this reflects itself as to why we see so much phishing, why we see so much password misuse, because when, we always say the title of this whole podcast, right? Identity at the center. Why has identity become such an important part of the defense and detection cycle? Because this is the things we see. If we have a million users, I guarantee you 10 of them have got a password of password 123. If we send a million phishing emails out, someone's going to answer. It's just bizarre. It's just a numbers game, right?
Right. And what I took from how this hack occurred was that somebody who was working in the support area just went into these accounts and changed the email address. So you can go in, change the email address if you have the access to the email address for, say, Joe Biden's account, you can then change the password. You can then put up a post and it can say whatever you want. Now that post might be taken down, quickly. Someone realizes this happened. At the same time, after you've gotten a few thousand Bitcoin transfers, those Bitcoin transfers are never coming back. So, think of when you're implementing identity management systems, try to think like a hacker. How could we take this system? How could somebody who has bad intent take the system and take over accounts and do bad things?
Yeah, if I think back to my time at SailPoint for 4 years, I was the CISO there. That was one of my big mantras was, let's think like the adversary, not just from an identity management products perspective, but from, defense and detection perspective, because we so often just assume the adversary is the classic Russian Chinese hacker, but considering who internally may have an axe to grind and what they might do about it, but the adversary is obviously a very broadly used term, but that was something that we did a lot of thinking about, and that comes into threat modeling. In order to do any form of threat modeling, you really have to think of who the adversary is and what the indication of compromise would be, and kind of walk through that track. So yeah, think like the adversary for sure. Very good idea.
Well, one of the things that I've taken away from this is that common sense isn't so common, right? You see that Bitcoin message is like, okay, really? Bill Gates is going to send me twice what I give him? Sure, he is. But it is that numbers game, like you mentioned, like both of you guys have mentioned, is, even if it's, 1% of a Twitter account responding, you think about the number of followers that these people have. And if it's 0.5% or half of a 0.5%, that's still a large number of people. And the last I heard was it was up over 100,000 that, the person had made off with from a Bitcoin perspective, which, not bad for an hour's worth of work, to get the message out there and do that. And, maybe it was a few more hours than that, but it seemed like it was a pretty good take, for the amount of time that was actually out there. I think it could have been a lot worse, right? What if this was a nation state that was looking to stoke things, especially in, at least on the U.S. side, the current presidency where he uses Twitter quite a bit. What if there had been a announcement there at that level that said that we were going to war or attacking something? So I feel like it could have been a lot worse, but yeah.
I think for Twitter, the damage is that wow, your defenses for this week, so it's like a brand image. It was a lot worse than the financial gain that this hacker got. I think they lucked out that it was somebody who's just looking to get away with some money. And I'm not sure if Twitter's going to turn around and refund people's money. People would probably have a hard time proving that. And Twitter, I don't know if they would even take responsibility for it. But I think to your point, had it been a nation state hack, that could have been a lot worse, which I think nation states are behind a lot of hacks these days.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it also highlights how carefully we have to think about account control and what it really means, what the risk is, what the threat really is across all types of access. Because as we know in identity, right, people have accounts everywhere. And this is a classic example of a platform that was never designed to have delegation. I mean, there isn't the notion of delegation. It has very, very weak entitlement and privilege management. I mean, it's kind of an all in or all out. And so what happens? There's no firewall. There's no break glass. There's no fire break. And so, it's just, and look how much damage can be done. To your point, if the president's message would have been the nukes have been released, what would the stock market have done? I mean, it's just that, you only need a 20-minute movement in stock to make a couple of $1 billion. So, kind of interesting.
Yeah, could have been worse. I think it hopefully will lead to some better controls and, maybe people taking with a grain of salt some of the messages that I might see out there and really trying to understand the validity of it. I think we've beaten up Twitter pretty good for now. I know there was another new incident, not new incident, but new information come out regarding a past incident around MGM. Jim, do you want to talk about that one?
Yeah, so I think it was really just the amount of data, the number of accounts that were exposed was increased from last year to this year. I read an article in Forbes. I kind of dove into it and mentioned that a lot of people believe that this industry, the hospitality industry, has been targeted by, in a way that was Chinese espionage, so kind of nation state hacking. And the rationale is that they're looking for patterns and information about, high level U.S. business executives. So they start trying. You could imagine if they can get the right information on the right person, they could blackmail that person and work their way into, positions where they could, cause problems. So, not something that I really had given a lot of thought to, using the hospitality industry in that way. But again, it's kind of thinking like your adversaries. And I don't even know that there was proof that it was a nation state incident with MGM. They've obviously run into other non-cybersecurity issues as well recently. If you read this article on Forbes, and maybe we can put it in the show notes. But just it's interesting how non-financial gain is. If financial gain is not the only motive to go ahead and hack systems and to capture data, especially when it comes to a nation state. They're not looking to steal a couple $1 million. They could care less about that. But having information about people that really, or the ability to go in and take down critical infrastructure. But in the case of the hospitality industry, they've had a lot of hacks in the past few years, and I think a lot of it goes back to underinvestment in IAM technologies. But it also has to do with that they've got a certain kind of information that is a prized possession in certain ways, right? Not for the kitty hacker who's looking to get away with money, like what happened with Twitter, but that information about where people are spending their time. They're in this place and when they should have been in that place. That's the kind of information that some actors would want to have.
Yeah, I think I agree completely. It's the two things that anyone with long-term adversarial plans in mind, they want metadata about people and movement, and they want attributes about those people, the basic personal information. And the more of that you have, the more you can validate it, the more you can create a picture of people, and the more you can attack those people. I mean, information is power, no doubt here, and that no doubt that's what they're after. And I think the other interesting observation from an identity management perspective is it's an industry which is currently suffering from a considerable amount of joiner, mover, leaver activity, and as we know, that is the introduction of vulnerability, accounts left unmanaged as people leave. And so I wouldn't be surprised if we're going to see more of that in industries where pure IT investment is sometimes of a lesser concern. I know MGM is actually a very diligent company and has invested quite well in their security technologies. But again, they have a massive attack surface. They've got how many employees? Many of which are not IT specialists, right? And so, it's just tough. It's one of the reasons why I am an ex-CISO because I don't want that job, because it just it's just a thankless task in many ways. You're just always outgunned by the adversary.
I think you brought up a great point there about the size of the attack surface, because we've worked in the hospitality industry as well, and the attack point isn't always going to be the website. Like, let me see if I can get into the website. It might be a misconfigured Amazon S3 bucket. Let's just go right to the source of the data. And if you're scanning those IP ranges and you know what to look for, so it's the path of least resistance a lot of times.
Yeah, the MGM thing is interesting because it was originally like a little, I think over 10 million is what was advertised, right, as the impact. And now they're saying it's over 142 million, which is a huge increase, right? I mean, that is just such an order of magnitude higher when it comes to the number. And then when you think about 142 million records and what that must be worth, it's being sold for a little over $2,900 on the dark web. So, fractions of a penny, right, for each of those records. It really is a volume game, as much as it is trying to target specific data or specific individuals, right? This is clearly just, hey, let's hoover up all the information and then someone will want it, right? Whether it's for reconnaissance or, whatever it may be, kind of what you were mentioning, Darran. That's just kind of where it goes, I think.
Yeah, and I didn't see in the article whether there were actually any actual password databases taken. It appears it was all just phone book type data, but of course, all information is power. And I think as we look out into the future, these mass databases of attributes, of information about people, will be that's the crux of the future, right? Because we're moving closer and closer towards attribute-based access. We're all now running our authentication through more and more centralized IDPs and using deferred attributes from other areas to actually control the access. And so, yeah, I think the intelligent adversary looks at this is an investment for the future. The more they put in their database, the more they can apply their AI to it, the more success they're going to have trying to pop a password or hit an account in the future.
Yeah, $3,000. Hey, I can get 142 million records. Will I ever use it? I don't know, maybe, but for that kind of chump change, let's say, right? That's an awful lot of data to get back. So those are kind of the two big things I think that hit this week. I know we skipped right over it, but Darran, you've been in the IAM space for a while, and we talked a little bit about your formerly being with SailPoint, and now an independent identity dude. Maybe we can start with our traditional question, or let's go back. Right, this is not starting with, but how did you get into IAM?
Yeah, in actual fact, I've in some respects I've kind of always been in IAM. I started out my career in systems administration, doing sysadmin for Unix and what would turn out to be our DBMS, ITSM systems, managing users, managing systems. Many of us in that space came from that background. And then I was actually working for a trade settlement company in London, and we were doing mass schema and user distribution on very early versions of Infomix, and so we had a problem with distributing the schema and the user account to the endpoint where the derivative settlement was happening. And that seemed like such an interesting problem in finance that we created a small company called DBMX, which did distributed user and schema management. And this was gosh in 92, 93. And that company was bought by Tivoli Systems, IBM. And that's how I got moved from London to Austin, Texas, where I am still now. And we became part of the Tivoli early user management infrastructure teams there, so part of systems management. So again, going from sysadmin to systems management, Tivoli had some user management capabilities, but then a team of us left Tivoli in about 2000 and created a company called Waveset Technologies, which many people know became the Sun Identity Manager. Waveset was bought by Sun in 2004. So that was really, I guess at that point, I could say identity management. I distinctly remember us having very active conversations with Gartner about the naming, right? To say, we want this to be identity management, not user administration as it was at the time. So I went through the whole Waveset cycle, which is a lot of fun, and into Sun, and then did a couple of other minor things, and then joined the team at SailPoint in 2006. And came from there. But I think that those three companies, for me, to waffle on a little further, sort of really capture three waves or phases that we've seen in identity management that I've been fortunate to be part of. That first Tivoli really being systems administration. It was a sysadmin tool for system administrators. The idea was how you can use root without giving someone a root password, basic delegation. And we left and created Waveset to really add connectivity and complex workflow approvals, because it was evident at that point, as distribution was happening, there were going to be systems everywhere and connectivity was required everywhere. And there wasn't an investment in the connectivity layer. And so in my mind, many ways, Waveset's job was to add extensive libraries of connectivity, to add complex workflow and approvals to the cycle. But the thing I think we got wrong in that second generation was it really still wasn't for the business user. I think identity still hadn't become such a central part of the user's experience in the way that we now know. And so that was the creation of SailPoint, was to really do the business side of identity. And so they're obviously starting with compliance, doing user access reviews, self-service access request, fulfillment, etc. So very much, as I say, my career has been that sort of progression through those three phases, from sysadmin to an automation tool to a business enablement tool. And so that's why I say an identity management dude, because to be honest with you, I don't think I've really done anything else. It makes me a little colloquial, really, apart from obviously taking on the CISO's role at SailPoint for 4 years. But
well, that's another one in my book, Jim. If we're scoring at home, my theory is that IAM chooses people. You don't choose IAM. It's just people kind of fell into it. So I'm going to chalk that up as another win for me.
Hey, Darran, I wanted to ask you something, since you were around in kind of the early days of SailPoint. I kind of got the impression, or at least I always tied, one of the most common definitions of IAM is knowing who has access to what. And I tied that back to SailPoint kind of coining that phrase, or more or less one place to go to know who has access to what. Do you feel that way, or do you feel like that was kind of an industry term that was, being thrown around by everybody?
No, I think we very much were at the right place at the right time at SailPoint. I mean, let's face it, we were the first, really, in many ways, to think of this whole gambit, what we call identity, which, is everything from front-end authentication to back-end authorization, and think of it exclusively from an administration and governance perspective. And so, yes, we very much, sort of academically, and was very much involved in that view, that you have to understand the current state. So, in other words, what things do look like, and that's who does have access to what. The current state is never ever in alignment with the desired state. I mean, that's entropy, right? That's how things work. People make mistakes. So we very much sort of said, well, let's first of all understand what people do have access to, which is actually fairly easy to do, right? It's the observation of state. You've got to aggregate the information. You've got to be able to see it. But then what should they have access to, which was sort of our second phase of SailPoint, was much more about policy, understanding who should have access to what and why. Very complex issue, because as you guys appreciate, sometimes no one knows, and it makes the business actually say, stop for a second. What should you have access to means understanding policy, understanding roles, understanding all the stuff that we understand. It's just a complex thing to do. And then thirdly, understanding how things are being used. So we sort of put those all together to your point about being the one-stop shop, which is the goal of IGA. I won't mention SailPoint anymore, perhaps, and just say for identity governance administration, is to understand what it does look like, what it should look like, and how it's being used, and then put capabilities on top of that. So yeah, no, we really did draw that triangle first, I think, and between those three, and say who has access to what as a key need.
Yeah, my feeling was, prior to SailPoint and Avexa really coming on the scene, the focus was pretty much what you called it earlier, user administration. Now, for the enterprise, it was centralizing that user administration and provisioning accounts. To me, that always had two potential weaknesses. One was a lot of work to integrate your central user administration tool to a downstream system. Now, you could really drive a lot of efficiency by doing it, but when you have an enterprise, you have hundreds of applications, and integrating with 100 or more applications becomes a nightmare. The second, and you never reach the nirvana where everything's integrated. The second problem was there's always the backdoor problem. I could still go to the application and add an account. I could still go to the application and increase my privileges, and my paper trail was in the application. So I could never just tell the auditors, go look at my central IAM system because that's the source of truth. Identity governance went out to the application, pulled back the data, compared what was with what should be, and you kick out the differences to discover who went through the back door.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Very useful and important use case. And I'd add to what you said there by highlighting that it's sometimes not a problem that there's a difference. And I think one of the areas that certainly the SailPoint product, and I know some of the newer IGA solutions, big advantage they had over that second generation of operational provisioning platforms was that they're quite comfortable with that delta, because you have to be, right? I mean, it's out of whack. You're not going to go and shut it down, right? There's a sysadmin digging you out of a hole here, right? Fixing the Twitter. I guarantee you, when they found out something was wrong with Twitter, a bunch of sysadmin accounts got checked out of a vault somewhere. Somebody started doing a whole bunch of things, right? Shutting down accounts, creating accounts, changing privileges. Now, we would have observed all that change in the old world of provisioning and gone, that's wrong. Overlay it with my mandated policy model. Fix it, right? And I think the thing that a governance-based approach does a very good job of is saying, hey, that's okay, but here's a set of actions that are clearly defined and documented that are going to happen. I'm going to create an approval flow that goes to the application owner. I'm going to email this person. I'm going to ping the SIM. I'm going to do a bunch of stuff. And then over a period of time, it might take 2 weeks, I'm going to put it back. So that sort of long-running cycle was very much something that a governance-based approach differs from a pure provisioning and connectivity-based approach. That time span.
Well, I think we've seen a shift, right? It used to be the giant behemoths, right? IBM and Oracle, and kind of the suite approach, right, where they do everything, or at least they claim to do everything. And now we've seen, over the last 15 years or so, more specific platforms around identity governance, right? SailPoint. You've got, things like Kurion, right, back in the day. And now there's this new platform. It's really not a new platform, but it's a platform that's existed the whole time, but has always been kept kind of separate. And that's ITSM, IT Service Management. And I think now there is, some discussions around building identity platforms into things like ServiceNow or, Remedy or things along those lines. And we actually had a conversation with Jackson Shaw last week around this as well, where, he sees a growing movement as well, where people are starting to think about identity in the context of putting it into their ITSM platform, whatever that may be. Is that something that you see coming along too, or do you have a differing opinion?
No, I would certainly agree with most of that. I think it's maybe it's a fourth wave, a fourth generation. So often today, in order to do identity and identity governance right, it kind of has to be a standalone platform in lots of ways, because it's such a big problem. Because we're carrying the weight of of governing authentication and authorization for everything, and that is such a colossally huge problem that it tends to solidify. But as more and more people are engaging in identity governance, it's no longer the realm of the rich and famous, the banks and those anointed to do so. There's been a need to simplify it and make it closer to the general IT platform. So I think that's one of the drivers. I haven't actually listened to Jackson's comments, but I'm going to guess that it calls on the idea that these things need to be closer together, and I do 100% agree with that. I think identity, and this is Ian Glazer, now over at Salesforce, formerly at Gartner. He did a great pitch one time where he talked about identity being part of and not apart from, and that was very much about the B2C business, consumer view of identity. But I think that's the case here, right? The identity governance and control lifecycle can't be apart from everything else. It has to be a part of everything else because it's such an important part of it. So I think a move to align identity processes with your core platforms, and I'll just in double quotes platforms, and I'll come back to that, is essential. Now, if you're a massive ITSM user, you're big on ServiceNow or BMC Remedy or whoever it might be. Let's pick on ServiceNow. That is your platform, and that should be in double quotes. The reason to bring those things closer together isn't just that you don't want to have two. It's that in order to integrate these things together, complexity, having a dev staff do it. I mean, I think the days of companies having 100 identity management engineers that are all Curion specialists, or all that's all they do is work on that platform. It's becoming a harder sell. And I think if your core identity processes are coming from that platform, it's obviously going to be an easier integrator, right? I've already got 50 ServiceNow developers, so I can extend my identity, which is, hey, let's face it, everybody does it, right? Find me an enterprise identity management deployment that isn't extended extensively. And where are you doing that customization? Well, you're doing it in SailPoint's custom environment. So there's a lot of reasons to look closely at that. And I think as consolidation comes down and identity becomes more part of the platforms, these people are going to have to make these decisions. Do I buy a standalone tool, or do I buy something that's integrated with the platform of choice that we use for everything else?
If I could throw into that, kind of just to play devil's advocate, I think that IAM is a big, hairy beast, right? There's a lot of things that IAM does, and it's kind of middleware to a lot of what you're doing. If you go for a platform play, it's just one more very big thing that would have to be undone if you decide you no longer want to be on that platform. Now, I don't think that any enterprise goes into a platform strategy lightly. My big concern is that, if you tie so much to the platform, you just become that much more dependent on that vendor. Whereas if you set IAM as in kind of a best of breed model, and you become unhappy with that vendor, they're not innovating, they're not treating you well, their prices have gone through the roof, you can move away from that vendor and you have a finite set. I mean, you have a finite set no matter what, but that functionality for just IAM, not tied to the vendor, would be less. So that's just kind of the feather in the cap of the best of breed approach, is that, you become somewhat more vendor independent.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it's horses and courses there a little. I mean, I think as you come down from, like I say, the rich and famous down to the man on the street, the drivers become different. And there's no question in my mind, every business needs to do identity governance in one form or another. Just the joiner, mover, leaver phase. I mean, let me put my CISO's hat on. I'd often say that the trouble is with identity management today is it's a dumbass card. If you get popped because you've got no joiner, mover, leaver processes in place, you don't have basic oversight over that administration, you get the dumbass card. No one comes in and says, oh, that's a crazy custom standalone process that no one understands. They're going to go buy it off the shelf from somebody. Go subscribe to a web service that does it. And so the sort of the drivers for best of breed, specialist, independent, right the way down to clickable, click and go service is changing over time. And I believe both will exist for some considerable time. So
right. Yeah, I made the case for the independent IAM, but I'm also thinking, like, if you were to want to go from platform to platform, so say you said, all right, our ITSM is where we want to do IAM because we direct everyone there to request new equipment, so why not go there to request new access? What if 5 years from now, Microsoft, with their Office 365, and you've deemed yourself a Microsoft shop, that's the other platform that you're extremely excited about. What if they come out with a whole new suite of identity governance and onboarding, and they just make it like the snap of a finger? And by the way, they say it's free with your Office 365 license. Now it's like, all right, now we have to make this big shift from one to the other. I mean, it's, again, I don't think it's a black and white argument, but I do think that as a buyer, you have to kind of think of both sides.
But I think that risk exists everywhere, right? There's always going to be something better coming down the road, right? Do you buy the MacBook now, or do you wait a few months and see what they come up with from a ARM architecture, right, and their new hardware? Is it going to be better? Who knows? And the same thing can be said for most technologies that are out there. So you go into a platform strategy with the idea that you're probably going to be on it for, you hope, right, 10 to 15 years, and that whoever you're selecting is going to be able to support that one. Because I think that's typically a fatal decision that sometimes gets made where you bet on the wrong platform. It's usually associated with some sort of personnel change, right, at an organization. But if you're always chasing, what if or the better, you may never actually get anything done.
Oh, that's a good point too.
Yeah, and to your example, feature buy, as it were. There is one other element here that I think is worth mentioning, and that is that it's this extensibility thing, right? There's no doubt in my mind that we are moving towards more packaged capabilities in the identity and access management space, right? Generally speaking, if you can't do what's in the UI by clicking some buttons and configuring a few bits of policy, stop and ask yourself how important it is, right? Because as we know, people spend hundreds of millions of dollars customizing, extending, and developing on top of these platforms. And I think one of the arguments I'm imagining that one would give if I worked for ServiceNow would be, do that extensibility in the language and the environment, in less of them, right? In this one, in the one that you've definitely invested in, where your developers are, where your extensibility is. And then as you start looking at things running in a purely web-based frame, where do you run it? Where does this is one thing that greatly troubles me, is where's the orchestration happening? People now buy Okta, they'll buy SailPoint, they'll have some ping in there, they'll have 2 or 3, they've got all this, and they build orchestration, right? They use a professional service to build orchestration between it. Where do they run that? Where is it actually running? Because that brain is now in charge, right? And I see people just I've got some custom PHP running in an AWS instance, and then at that point I've pulled the rest of my hair out, because that's a fatal mistake, right? So the argument would be, do that on the platform, extend that runtime into the platform. And I think that's one of the advantages that an Azure focused IAM strategy will have. I'm going to say it's all here. The directory's here, the connectivity's here, the authorization is here, and the orchestration is built here. And that's a big thing.
I don't think I have anything else to add to that. I mean, this is pretty much, I think we covered it. I know that, you've been very generous with your time. I wanted to really kind of bring up something that you wrote a while back. I think it was 2019. You had a book called Identity Attack Vectors, and I thought it was excellent. I think it should be required reading for anybody who's in getting into the IAM space. It does a good job of helping people understand that. And I think what was relatively smart around that concept was the 5 A's of enterprise IAM: authentication, authorization, administration, audit, and analytics. Makes it real easy to remember. Can you talk, briefly about that book and how it came about?
Yeah, sure thing. The book concept and first two books in the series were actually Maury Habers, who's the CTO at Beyond Trust. He's now the CISO there as well. So we were both CTOs and CISOs for software vendors, which was interesting. Maury wrote two books in the series around asset attack vectors and then privilege attack vectors, and wanted to write one on the importance of identity. Was aware that he wasn't an identity specialist, and so reached out to me, and he and I have always had a great relationship, and so asked if I would co-author the book with him. When we started looking at it, it became clear to me as I looked around internally at SailPoint and in external publications, I couldn't find a lot of definitions. It's like there wasn't an identity governance book. And so in some ways, I would have almost relabeled the book, Identity Attack Vectors, AKA, what is identity governance and why you should care. Because it's such an important part of how identities are attacked, the administration and audit. So that was key. And as you mentioned, the 5 A's was a core part of explaining what identity governance is all about, because we all understand authentication, right? I'm not a big authentication fan myself. Love it, can't do without it, right? But it's a binary decision, right? It's not particularly complex. It's a massive problem, but authorization, understanding who should have access, right? Very complex. Love that. But it was important. It was important for me to explain that the governance, identity governance, isn't authentication and authorization. In fact, it's something that should be surgically separated from authentication and authorization. From almost a checks and balances perspective, I can't do it. My job is to administer it and give it oversight. So that's the 3rd A, right? It's administration. The 4th A, audit, and the 5th A being analytics. So it's kind of draws the spectrum across identity and access management, and then says, here's your line for identity governance. So I'm glad you enjoyed it. And it's kind of, I figured the only person that was going to read it was my mum. She's got about 10 she's got about 10 copies, but
I love it. I have the Kindle version, and I thought it was excellent. And I think it's a really good read. It's an easy read. And I think that's why I enjoyed it so much, because it didn't get super technical. It did a really good job of explaining concepts that I think if you're just starting out in the IAM space, or even if you've been in it for a while, it's a good way to go back, because I think it also helps with messaging and helping people understand the importance of IAM. And sometimes that gets lost, right? From the, oh yeah, just another breach, another hack, who cares? It's going to happen again. Big deal. But I think it's a good way to get started. And we'll have a link to that book in our show notes too, so people can find it easily in case they want to check it out. Now that you are an ex-CISO, do you have any projects that you're working on around that, or are you going to write another book or something else?
I am actually. I intend to remain an ex-CISO. As I said, that was probably the hardest job I've ever had, and as a vendor, to actually, rather than selling technology, actually buying and deploying technology, just a remarkable experience. I mean, I learned so much from everybody, from my peers, my colleagues, from people I employed. It was just a fantastic experience. I think every vendor should spend their time in the hopper, in the barrel, right? Trying to be that person. Don't intend to do it again. I am actually working on a book that kind of covers some of my experiences, actually, tentatively titled The Confessions of an Ex-CISO, Security, Privacy, and Compliance at Enterprise Scale. And because I really want to try and pass on some of the, maybe not unique, but certainly to me, they were realizations around the complexity of running a security program, but running an identity-centric security program. Because as you can imagine, being a CISO inside an identity management company, you sure as hell better have good identity, right? You sure as hell better be identity first. And so it came very clear to me very quickly that it's very difficult, and they're exactly the same challenges that every company has. And so I wanted to try and capture some of those. So I've been working my way through, doing a lot of interviewing and speaking to other CISOs about what their challenges are, and looking at some of the cultural memes about how you start making a program identity centric. And that's when we think of identity and security programs, it's anti-phishing training. Well, no, I'm talking about how do you train your security teams to think identity first. And really just sort of walk through some of the experiences we had and the experiences I'm frequently told of by my peers at other companies. So yeah, pretty interesting topic.
Love to have you back when you're getting closer to put that out there so we can have a conversation around it. Is there a time frame when you think you'll have that out into the public domain?
It's probably going to be the end of the year. I'm your classic. Gee, I better write some more of that book. I get so I've got a Raspberry Pi. I got my old Raspberry Pi back out on my desk. I found it in a drawer, and I'm like, but next thing I know, a week's gone by, and I'm messing around with Linux. So I do get distracted, but it will hopefully by the end of this year I'll be in some sort of draft ready for some form of publication. So probably early in the spring, to be honest.
I know we're coming up here on the end of our time, but there were a couple of trends that I think that we've spotted. And we've certainly had some conversations around that over the last few weeks with some of the guests we've had, like Eve Mailer on the UMA side. We're going to have Andrew Shikiar on in a couple of weeks, I believe, from the FIDO perspective. I know you've had some involvement with the SCIM standard. Is there any news or updates around SCIM that you feel like you can share or want to talk about?
Yeah, I certainly would. I've always been involved in standards. In fact, I was the editor of the SPML, which I think we can say was the first identity provisioning standard, and was very much involved with its successor and more successful standard of SCIM, the System of Cross-Domain Identity Management. And as I've retired from SailPoint and had some more time on my hands, one of the projects that I've meant to do was to come back to the standards community. So I've actually been re-engaging around SCIM, and in talking to a lot of the practitioners, it became very clear very quickly that there was room for improvement with SCIM. There was need to address some new use cases, some new capabilities, and to create some operational enhancements for the standard. So I'm busy at the moment trying to, in effect, drum up support to do a rechartering of an IETF working group requires participation, basically. So I'm glad you asked me that, because maybe folks that are listening, if you're interested or have a vested interest in SCIM, and if you're in identity, you should, because it's the de facto lingua firma for changing identity profiles, right? If you're talking to somebody over any comms line, even internal behind the firewall, and you're making change requests, in effect, LDAP-like change requests, you should be doing it over SCIM. So I would say if you're interested in SCIM, have a vested interest in it, get back on the IETF list and see the conversation and follow it. And hopefully we can get a new release of SCIM, an effort for it started soon. And we're going to address some really interesting things, like how to include events and messages. That would be really cool, to have an event-based bus for identity change messages. That could change a lot.
Is there room for all these standards between SCIM and things like FIDO and UMA and everything else that's out there? Do you see any overlap where people are going to kind of have to come together and figure out where the borders may be for all these different countries?
Yeah, to some degree. It's fortunate that most standards participants, most people that are in there writing specs, that's what they do for a living, as it were. And so they're very well versed in related specifications. You mentioned that you'd had Eve Mailer on. I'm aware of what UMA does. Never participated in the activity. And so I think you get this sort of natural division. I know that SCIM shouldn't do anything here. And Eve knows that if she's going to make a change request, she's going to want to pull an identity record from another system, and she wants to do it, in a RESTful way, she would specify the use of SCIM. So I think we're kind of fortunate that mechanically the overlap is often dealt with by the practitioner. But boy, what a challenge from a higher level, with FastFed and OpenID, and there's so many different, FIDO, you mentioned, there's so many different activities. What do they all mean and where do they fit together? And a lot of the time it's a problem for the vendor, but never let it be just the vendors that participate. You really do need the consumer of the technology, advocating and part of that run. So I think it has a natural balance frequently. Unfortunately for Skim, it is very much accepted as the lingua firma for identity change across open REST protocol.
Jim, is there anything that you want to ask Darran before we wrap up for this episode?
I just throw out there to Darran what books are you reading right now? Where do you go to sharpen the saw? There's two things. One, I think a lot of our listeners are practitioners who are listening to this show and trying to get smarter, trying to get educated. And that's why we have guests like yourself on. And then the other thing is, I think this is kind of like the time capsule of IAM. Someday somebody might look back on this and want to know about the IAM industry and kind of, hopefully this is a good representation of a lot of the people and a lot of the thinking that went into this industry at this time and in the past, 20, 30 years. But, let's start with sharpening the saw. Like, what are you looking at these days? What are you reading?
Well, I think be perpetually curious. I'll be honest with you, I don't read a lot of books. I read a lot of specifications and a lot of product manuals. And I think you're doing that in a very diverse way. It's very easy for us to become quite colloquial. We just do our identity thing. Give you a great example. I've just installed pfSense. Now, I'm not a network engineer. I mean, next CISO, right? I'm used to dealing with board members and funding and other things, but it's like a refresher just to be chucked back in, looking at the details of what's happening on a complex NAT firewall appliance like a pfSense. So I do things like that. Like I said, I've spent 3 days messing with firewall rules and looking at what's going across my network, and I don't know, just sort of I think doing that in a diverse way. And I think the true practitioner, the guys writing code, they're always writing code, but those of us that get more involved in policy and strategy sometimes get too far from the technology.
I do agree with that. The further you stray away from being able to jump into the guts, things are changing very quickly. I mean, you were in systems administration around the time I was. Imagine the concept of Docker. I mean, you're not even talking servers anymore. You're talking containers. And if you don't keep up to date and try to play around with the tools and try to figure it out, I'm a big advocate of watching videos on YouTube. But if you don't spend some time learning those things, those concepts pass you by and then you become a dinosaur.
Yeah, I agree completely. But the interesting thing is, the reason for doing that, I would say, is the basics never change. The basics of security, identity, some of these things we talked about, high-level memes about separating the do from the administration and the governance. That exact same thing is going to repeat itself in the containerization world. We're seeing it happening, right? We just repeat the same mistakes time and time again. And that if we have to sort of keep the same disciplines regardless of the implementation technology. But if you don't understand the technology enough to have a conversation, right? I turn up, Mr. CISO, I turn up with the team, right, guys, what are we doing for identity in our Kubernetes? And they all go, they use 2 sentences that just blow me out, right? They talk about a piece of the implementation technology. I don't even know what it means. I'm dead. The conversation's over. So we kind of have to remain sharp. Now, I love that thought, sharpening the blade, as it were, continuously, so that we can drive what is basically the same old, right? Administration, good practice, separation, administration, audit, and governance. So that's kind of what I do.
Yeah, no, I know. A lot of times where we think, oh, this is whiz bang, this is new. You talk to somebody who is a mainframe expert, and they're like, yeah, what's old is new again. It's all the stuff we were doing on the mainframe. obviously is different, but a lot of the concepts do repeat themselves.
They absolutely do. And then to your time capsule, I mean, boy, could you have named this podcast better? I think we'll come back in time and we'll go, oh, I remember when we moved from network centricity to identity centricity. It's gonna be like walking on the moon. It's the, Armstrong's the guy we're going to remember, right? First foot on another planet.
All right. Well, I think we're coming here at the end. Darran, is there anything else you want to close with before we part ways here?
No, always great to chat with you guys. We love this space, the three of us, and hopefully, if ever I can do anything to help advocate for identity as a space and for it to be at the center of security, I'm here to do it. So thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much. And we'll have a bunch of notes in the show notes for today, which you can visit Darran on the web at darranrolls.com, DARRANROLLS. And you can visit us, the show itself, at identityatthecenter.com. And you can always find us in your podcast app, which is probably where you're listening to us. So with that, we're going to go ahead and close it for this week. Thank everybody for listening. And thank you, Darran, for joining the conversation this week. And we'll talk with everyone in the next one. You've been listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. For more episodes, visit identityatthecenter.com.